The storm had swallowed the mountain whole by the time the radio crackled to life in the operations center. Static, then silence, then a voice that shouldn't have been there, calm, almost conversational, like she was ordering coffee instead of reporting the impossible. Widow actual to any station. I'm 15 miles out with 6 souls on board and one engine eating itself alive. Need immediate vectors to anywhere with a runway longer than my marriage lasted. The joke landed in dead silence. Every head in the Tactical Operations Center turned toward the speaker, toward Commander Eric Tavish, who stood with his arms crossed, staring at the weather display like he could burn a hole through the crimson mass pulsing across the screen. Nobody flew in this. Nobody. The Hindu Kush didn't forgive mistakes on clear days, and tonight the mountains had teeth made of ice and wind shear that could rip a Hercules apart like tissue paper. "Who the hell is Widow?" someone asked. Tavish didn't answer immediately. His jaw worked like he was chewing through old memories he'd rather have left buried. When he finally spoke, his voice carried weight that made the younger operators straighten. "Captain Marlena Kovac, A-10 driver out of Bagram. Flew close air support missions back when half of you were still in high school." The tactical display showed what couldn't be shown. A single transponder blip crawling across the screen through weather that had grounded everything with wings for the last 6 hours. The storm system stretched for 200 miles, a rotating mass of violence that the meteorologists had named with clinical detachment, but that pilots called the Reaper. Wind gusts exceeding 90 knots. Visibility measured in feet, not miles. Icing conditions that turned aircraft into falling bricks. "She's flying through that?" a Navy liaison asked, his voice climbing half an octave. "In a warthog." The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately called the Warthog by those who flew it and everyone who'd ever been grateful for its existence, was many things. It was tough. It was ugly. It was built around a cannon that fired depleted uranium rounds the size of beer bottles. But it was not, by any reasonable definition, an all-weather aircraft. It had been designed to fly low and slow, to survive ground fire that would shred anything prettier, to bring hell to earth and then limp home with half its parts missing. It had not been designed to thread through a Himalayan thunderstorm with zero visibility and ice building on every surface. Yet there she was, that single blip on the screen, tracking steadily south through the impossible. Tavish reached for the radio handset, his knuckles white around the grip, and keyed the transmission. "Widow Actual, this is Guardian Operations. We read you. Say status and souls on board." The response came through layers of interference, her voice cutting in and out like a bad phone connection, but the steadiness never wavered. "Guardian, Widow Actual. I've got 6 SEAL team members from Raptor Element. One with a sucking chest wound, one missing most of his left leg below the knee, and 4 who are mostly pissed off they're not already drinking. We were 5 minutes from exfil when their bird took an RPG through the tail rotor. They went down hard. Crew didn't make it. I was supposed to be their air cover, and I still had stores. So I figured, why waste a perfectly good dirt strip in a valley that was about to get a lot more crowded? The operations center had gone silent, except for the ambient hum of electronics and the whisper of the ventilation system. On the big screen, satellite imagery showed the valley she was talking about, a narrow slash between peaks, barely wide enough for a helicopter, completely wrong for a fixed-wing aircraft that landed at speeds most cars couldn't reach on the highway. You put an A-10 down in Tangier Valley. Tavish's voice carried disbelief wrapped in something that might have been respect or might have been horror. Guardian, it's not like I had a lot of options that didn't involve watching good men bleed out while I flew circles overhead. The valley had about 3,000 feet of reasonably flat dirt, give or take the rocks and the Taliban technical that tried to contest the approach. Emphasis on tried. Someone in the back of the operations center let out a low whistle. Landing an A-10 in an unimproved mountain valley while under fire was the kind of thing that lived in stories told in pilot bars, not in real life. The Warthog could do it, technically. It had been built with rough field capability, with landing gear tough enough to take the abuse. But the gap between technically possible and actually survivable was measured in skill, nerve, and pure unfiltered luck. "How'd you get them aboard?" Tavish asked. "Warthog doesn't exactly have a passenger compartment." I pulled the survivability ballast from behind the seat, moved some of the survival gear around, and made it work. They're stacked like cordwood back there, and the weight and balance math would make an engineer weep, but we're airborne and that's what counts. Airborne through a storm that had sent even the most experienced pilots running for cover. The radar showed the cell intensifying, the rotation tightening as the system fed on the temperature differential between the high peaks and the warming valleys below. Lightning flickered through the clouds at irregular intervals, illuminating the operations center in strobing flashes that painted everyone in shades of blue and white. Lieutenant Maya Restrepo, the duty officer, pulled up the extended forecast on her terminal and felt something cold settle in her stomach. The storm wasn't moving. If anything, it was spreading, fingers of severe weather reaching out to clutch at every possible approach corridor to every possible landing site within 200 miles. "Commander," she said quietly, her eyes not leaving the screen. "We need to start looking at options. She can't stay up there forever, and this weather isn't clearing." Tavish turned to look at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her think he knew more about the pilot currently threading her way through the impossible than he'd shared. "Start running the numbers on Salerno, Bagram, and Gardes. Factor in her fuel state, the weather, and the fact that she's overweight with battle damage." "What kind of battle damage?" That voice came from the back, from Master Sergeant Cole Hendricks, a combat controller who'd spent enough time coordinating close air support to know that battle damage wasn't a small detail. It was often the detail that turned a bad situation into a fatal one. The radio crackled again before Tavish could answer, and Kavach's voice filled the operations center with words delivered in that same maddeningly calm tone. Guardian, be advised, I took some ground fire on departure. Nothing critical yet, but my right engine is running about 50 degrees hotter than I'd like, and I'm getting some vibration through the stick that suggests something back there isn't happy about the current flight regime. Also, the hydraulics for the number 2 system are reading low. Could be instrumentation. Could be I'm pissing fluid somewhere I can't see. Could be meant definitely, in the careful language pilots used when they didn't want to admit how bad things actually were. The A-10's redundancy was legendary. It had been designed to survive the kind of damage that would turn other aircraft into debris, with backup systems for the backup systems and control runs routed through separate paths, so that battle damage couldn't take everything at once. But redundancy meant you could lose systems and keep flying. It didn't mean those losses didn't matter. Didn't mean you weren't bleeding capabilities with every mile, every minute in the air. Tavish set the handset down and turned to face the room. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from decades of making decisions that meant life or death for people he'd never met. I need options, people. She's got 6 SEAL team members aboard, at least 2 of them critical, and she's flying a damaged aircraft through the worst weather we've seen in 6 months. Start working the problem. The operations center shifted into motion like a machine finding its rhythm. Restrepo pulled up airfield data, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she sorted by runway length, available emergency services, weather conditions. Another operator started coordinating with the air rescue teams, getting helicopters spun up on standby in case Kavach had to put down somewhere creative. Hendricks got on the line with the SEAL command, updating them that their missing team was accounted for but not yet safe. Through it all, that single blip continued its steady crawl across the tactical display, a tiny marker representing an aircraft that shouldn't have been flying, carrying men who shouldn't have survived, piloted by a woman whose name was starting to ring bells in the minds of those old enough to remember. Tavish pulled up her service record on his terminal, scanning through the highlights with the practiced eye of someone who knew how to read between the lines. Captain Marlena Kavach. 12 years in service, 10 of them flying the A-10. 3 deployments to Afghanistan, 2 to Iraq back when that war was still hot. Distinguished Flying Cross with Valor, Purple Heart. And there, buried in the middle of the file where you had to know to look, the reason for the call sign that had raised eyebrows when she'd first used it on the radio. Her husband had been a ranger, a team leader with 3rd Battalion. They'd met during her first deployment, one of those wartime romances that happened fast and burned bright, and somehow managed to survive the distance and the danger until it didn't. He'd been killed 7 years ago during a direct action raid in Kandahar province, died covering his team's withdrawal after their primary target turned out to have 10 times the security they'd expected. She'd been overhead that night, providing close air support, close enough to hear the gunfire over the radio, close enough to put 30-millimeter rounds into every building that so much as looked threatening, but not close enough to stop what happened. The call sign had appeared in her radio checks the week after the funeral. Widow. Blunt, dark, daring anyone to comment. Some of the other pilots had suggested she pick something else, something that didn't carry so much weight, but she'd shut that down with a look that could have melted steel. The name stayed. Now it crackled through the operations center speakers like a ghost refusing to be forgotten, attached to a woman who was currently demonstrating why she'd earned that distinguished flying cross, and why the Air Force had kept her flying even as younger pilots cycled through and out. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, the radar painted a picture that was getting worse, the reds deepening to purples that indicated hail, wind shear, the kind of conditions that could flip an aircraft on its back and send it tumbling through the sky like a child's toy. Widow Actual Guardian, say your intentions. We're working on options, but the weather is degraded at every suitable field within your fuel range. There was a pause, longer than the radio lag should have accounted for. When Kavech came back, her voice carried a note of dry humor that somehow made the situation worse instead of better. Guardian Widow, my intentions are to keep this collection of spare parts pointed generally south until the wings stop making lift or we run out of things to burn. After that, I'm open to suggestions. Tavish closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them and made a decision. Widow, Guardian Actual, we're going to bring you into Gardes. Weather is marginal but improving. Runway is 11,000 feet of concrete, and they've got the emergency services to handle your passengers. Be advised, current conditions at field are visibility 3/4 of a mile in heavy snow, winds 270 at 28 gusting 42, ceiling indefinite. How's your fuel? Guardian, I'm showing about 55 minutes of flying time remaining, and that's if I lean the mixture until the engines complain. The extra weight is drinking fuel like it's free, and the damage isn't helping efficiency. 55 minutes to where I need to be, or 55 minutes until I'm making decisions nobody wants to think about. The math was brutal and simple. Gardes was 42 minutes away in a straight line through perfect conditions. They didn't have perfect conditions. They had a storm system that was going to force her to dogleg around the worst cells, adding time and distance to every mile, burning fuel she couldn't spare, while flying an aircraft that was hemorrhaging capability with every minute it stayed airborne. Restrepo looked up from her calculations, her face carefully neutral in the way that meant the news wasn't good. Commander, even if she makes it to Gardes, the approach is going to be challenging. The weather's coming from the west, which means she'll be landing with a quartering tailwind component unless we can vector her for a different runway. But the shorter runway isn't long enough for a damaged hog that's overweight with battle damage. What about Bagram? Someone suggested. Tavish shook his head. Too far north. She'd never make it with the fuel she's got. Gardes is the only realistic option, which means we make it work. He keyed the radio again. Widow, Guardian. Gardes is your best option. We'll have emergency services standing by. Can you accept radar vectors for traffic? Guardian, my radar is somewhere between degraded and decorative at this point. I'm navigating by GPS and the occasional glimpse of terrain when the clouds decide to stop being so damn clingy. If you want to give me headings and tell me when to turn, I'm listening. And so they began the delicate dance of talking an aircraft through conditions that would have turned most pilots around before they started. Restrepo took the lead, her voice steady as she called out headings and altitudes, threading Kavach between the worst cells while keeping her generally pointed toward Gardes. The radar showed the path like a maze drawn in shades of red and purple, narrow corridors of merely terrible weather between walls of atmospheric violence. In the cockpit of Widow 01, the tactical display showed her formal call sign now, the operations center having pulled her flight plan from earlier in the day. Marlena Kavach flew by instinct and instrument, her hands steady on the stick and throttle despite the turbulence that kept trying to shake the aircraft apart. The A-10 bucked and shuddered, ice building on the leading edges faster than the anti-ice system could sublimate it away, the airframe groaning under stresses it had never been designed to handle for this long. Behind her, in the space that was supposed to hold survival gear, and not much else, 6 Navy SEALs hung on to whatever they could reach and tried not to think about the fact that they were flying through a storm in an aircraft designed to fight tanks, not weather. Petty Officer First Class James Dutton, the team medic, kept pressure on his teammate's chest wound while simultaneously trying to keep the tourniquet on another man's leg from loosening as the aircraft bounced through the turbulence. He'd already used most of his medical supplies during the initial stabilization after the helicopter crash. Now he was down to pressure, prayer, and the hope that they'd get to an actual surgical team before the worst-case scenarios caught up with them. How much longer? Someone shouted over the howl of wind that leaked through gaps in the canopy seal. Kavach's voice came through the intercom, clear despite the chaos. However long it takes, try to stay still back there. The weight and balance on this thing is already questionable, and I'd rather not find out what happens if you all shift to one side at once. The storm battered them without mercy, wind sheer pushing the aircraft around like it weighed nothing, while Kavach fought to maintain altitude and heading. The right engine temperature continued to climb, now pushing into the red zone on the gauge, while the vibration through the control stick had progressed from annoying to concerning. Something in the tail section wasn't right. She could feel it in the way the aircraft wanted to yaw left, could hear it in the slightly off-pitch whine of the damaged engine. In the operations center, they watched her progress with the kind of focused intensity that turned minutes into hours. Every mile was a victory. Every heading change that kept her out of the worst weather was another small miracle in a night that was running on them. Tavish stood motionless, his eyes locked on the display, mentally flying every mile with her. The radio crackled. "Guardian Widow, I've got a problem." The temperature in the operations center dropped 10 degrees despite the heating system continuing to hum. Those 5 words carried more weight than any lengthy technical explanation, because pilots didn't admit to problems unless they were serious enough that denial was no longer an option. "Widow, Guardian, go ahead. My right engine just decided it doesn't want to be an engine anymore. I'm showing catastrophic temperature rise, oil pressure dropping towards zero, and enough vibration that I'm pretty sure parts are about to start departing the aircraft in directions not covered by the flight manual. I'm shutting it down before it decides to catch fire or seize up or otherwise ruin everyone's evening." Single engine. She was going to fly the rest of the approach on one engine, through a storm, overweight with battle damage, and 6 people depending on her to thread every needle perfectly or die trying. The A-10 could fly on one engine. Barely. It had been designed with enough power margin that losing an engine wasn't automatically fatal. But that margin assumed you weren't overweight, weren't damaged, weren't trying to fly through conditions that were challenging enough with both engines running fine. "Widow Guardian, confirm you're securing the right engine. Be advised, Gardes is now 31 miles at your 12 o'clock. Weather is holding steady. Emergency services are positioned and ready. You can do this." There was a pause, then Kovach's voice came back with that same dry humor that seemed to be her default setting when things went sideways. "Guardian, I appreciate the pep talk, but right now I'm more concerned with the aerodynamics than the psychology. Single-engine performance in this configuration is going to be interesting. And by interesting, I mean I'm about to find out if the performance charts in the manual were optimistic or pessimistic. Stand by." The operations center held its collective breath as the blip on the screen wavered, dropped 100 feet in altitude, then steadied as Kovach wrestled the aircraft back under control with only one engine providing thrust. The asymmetric thrust wanted to push the nose left, wanted to put the aircraft into a spin that would be unrecoverable at this altitude in these conditions. She countered with rudder, with aileron, with trim adjustments that were more art than science, because the manual hadn't been written for this exact combination of bad circumstances. Hendricks, the combat controller, pulled up a secure channel to the SEAL command and updated them with economical precision. Raptor element located and recovered by Air Force asset. 6 souls aboard. 2 critical medical assistance urgent. Current status is aircraft experiencing emergencies while attempting approach through severe weather. ETA to Gardes approximately 30 minutes. Recommend you have surgical team standing by. The voice on the other end of the line was tight. What kind of emergencies are we talking about? The kind where she's flying on one engine through a storm that grounded everything else and trying to land an overweight, battle-damaged aircraft at the edge of its performance envelope. The kind where she's either going to pull off something that'll be taught at test pilot school, or we're going to lose everyone aboard. I can't tell you which yet. The line went quiet for a moment then. Tell your pilot that Raptor Element's commander wants her to know those are his boys she's carrying. Whatever it takes to bring them home. Hendricks relayed the message, and Kovach's response was immediate. Guardian, tell Raptor Command that I've been in the business of bringing people home for a long time now. I don't intend to break that streak tonight, engine problems or not. But I'm going to need some help from your weather gods because this storm isn't getting any friendlier. The storm, as if hearing the challenge, intensified. Wind shear alerts lit up the radar display, bright yellow cautions that indicated turbulence severe enough to damage aircraft structures. Restrepo adjusted her vectors, threading Kovach through an increasingly narrow path that kept her away from the worst of it while still pointing generally toward Gardes. Widow, Guardian. Recommend heading 220, descend and maintain 8,000 feet. Weather is showing moderate turbulence with occasional severe. Icing conditions continuing, visibility near zero. You're 23 miles from threshold. Current winds at field 270 at 31 gusting 47. 220 and down to 8, Widow. The descent was controlled, measured, the kind of careful flying that came from years of experience and the knowledge that every control input mattered when you were operating this close to the edge. The single remaining engine howled, pushed to its limits to maintain airspeed while fighting the headwind that was trying to slow them down. Fuel state was becoming critical now. The gauge showed less than 30 minutes remaining, and that was assuming the engine continued to run at current consumption rates, which was optimistic given how hard she was pushing it. In the back, Dutton felt his patient's pulse weakening despite everything he was doing to keep blood pressure up. The chest wound was worse than he'd initially thought, the kind of injury that needed an operating room and trained surgeons and access to blood products that existed somewhere other than the cargo area of an A-10 currently being thrown around the sky like dice in a cup. "We need to get on the ground," he shouted into the intercom. "Now would be good. 10 minutes ago would have been better." Kovach's voice came back flat, drained of the earlier humor. "Working on it. Tell your guy to hang on. We're almost there." Almost was relative. 20 miles through a storm in an aircraft with one engine and multiple systems degraded wasn't almost anything except almost out of time, almost out of altitude, almost out of options. The A-10 shuddered through another patch of severe turbulence. the wings flexing in ways that would have terrified anyone who didn't understand that the aircraft had been built by the lowest bidder, but engineered by people who understood that close air support pilots needed something that could take a beating and keep flying. The operations center fell into the practiced routine of talking someone down through an emergency approach. Restrepo called out altitudes and headings with metronomic precision. Another operator coordinated with the tower at Gardes, clearing all other traffic away from the approach corridor and having emergency vehicles positioned at intervals along the runway. Tavish watched it all with the detachment that came from having seen too many emergencies over too many years, but his hands were clenched tight enough that his knuckles had gone white. Widow, Guardian, you're 15 miles from threshold. Begin your descent to 6,000 feet. Expect radar vectors for the straighten approach to runway 27. Weather at field is now visibility 1/2 mile in heavy snow. Winds 280 at 29 gusting 43. How's your fuel? Guardian, I'm showing 20 minutes. Maybe 25 if I can get a favorable wind for the approach and don't have to go around for any reason. The engine is running rough now, probably because I've been asking it to do the work of two and it's getting tired of my requests. Fair warning, if I don't get this landing on the first attempt, there probably won't be a second one. No pressure then. Just thread a damaged aircraft through weather that had grounded everything else. Nail the approach with non-standard crosswinds and visibility that meant she wouldn't see the runway until she was practically on top of it, all while flying on one engine with 6 lives, depending on getting every detail exactly right. Just another Tuesday for an A-10 pilot. Except it wasn't. Even for the Warthog community, known for their casual attitude toward impossible situations and their willingness to fly missions that made other pilots reach for their life insurance policies, this was extraordinary. The scattered applause that broke out in the operations center when Kovacs confirmed she was beginning her final descent wasn't for the aircraft. It was for the pilot, for the sheer stubborn competence it took to still be flying when every rational calculation said she should have found somewhere to put down hours ago. 10 miles. Descend and maintain 4,000 feet. Turn right heading 255 for the final approach course. 255 and down to 4 Widow. The heading change was smooth despite the single engine, despite the turbulence, despite everything. She'd found the rhythm of the damaged aircraft, learned its quirks and compensated for them, made peace with the fact that this landing was going to be more controlled crash than graceful touchdown. The snow intensified as she descended, thick wet flakes that stuck to the windscreen faster than the wipers could clear them, cutting visibility to almost nothing. The world outside became a gray void punctuated by occasional glimpses of terrain that appeared and vanished like ghosts. Ice continued to build despite the anti-ice system, adding weight she didn't have margin for, degrading the aerodynamics further. 8 miles. You are on course, slightly above glide path. Winds now 280 at 32 gusting 45. Emergency equipment is in position. Widow. That single word acknowledgement, no wasted breath on unnecessary communication. Kovac was in the zone now, that place where good pilots went when things got serious, where the outside world faded, and all that mattered was the instruments and the aircraft, and the rapidly shrinking distance between where they were and where they needed to be. In the operations center, silence had fallen except for Restrepo's steady voice calling out the approach. Everyone else had stopped what they were doing to watch the final miles play out on the display. The blip descended, following the glide path with precision that seemed impossible given the circumstances. 5 miles on course on glide path. You should be picking up the approach lights now. Nothing from Kovac. The windscreen was a wall of white, the snow so thick that the approach lights were invisible until she was close enough to reach out and touch them. The aircraft shuddered through wind shear, dropped 50 feet, fought its way back to the glide path as she poured power into the remaining engine and hoped it wouldn't choose this moment to fail. 3 miles. Runway is at your 12 o'clock, visibility poor but holding. Winds 270 at 28 gusting 40. You're cleared to land runway 27. Still nothing. The silence stretched, broken only by the sound of breathing in the operations center, by the hum of electronics, by the whisper of snow against windows thousands of miles away from where an A-10 fought its way through the final miles. 2 miles. Slightly right of course, turn left heading 250. The correction was immediate, the aircraft banking gently despite the asymmetric thrust, despite the ice, despite the battle damage that made every control input feel like fighting through mud. 1 mile. You should have the runway environment now. And there, through the snow and the darkness, the approach lights appeared like a string of pearls leading down to salvation or disaster. Kovac dropped the landing gear, felt the additional drag as the wheels came down and locked, watched the airspeed decay as the single engine struggled to maintain flying speed against the increased resistance. The runway materialized from the murk, concrete blessed and beautiful and exactly where it was supposed to be. The A-10 dropped toward the threshold, bouncing in the turbulence, wandering left and right as gusts tried to push it off course. Kovac corrected with small, precise inputs, keeping the nose pointed down the center line, managing the airspeed with throttle adjustments that were more prayer than science, because the performance charts hadn't been written for this configuration. The main wheels touched down hard, harder than any training landing, hard enough that the gear struts compressed to their limits and bounced the aircraft back into the air. Kovac didn't try to save it, didn't pull back on the stick to cushion the second touchdown. She let the aircraft settle, accepting the hard landing as the price of getting everyone down alive, and deployed the thrust reverser on the good engine while simultaneously standing on the brakes. The A-10 decelerated with authority born of desperation, bleeding airspeed as the runway unreeled ahead of them. 8,000 feet suddenly feeling insufficient, as the aircraft refused to slow as quickly as it should have with only one engine providing reverse thrust. Emergency vehicles paced them along the taxiway, bright lights cutting through the snow, ready to respond if the landing went wrong in the final seconds. But Kovacs held it together, kept the aircraft tracking straight despite the asymmetric thrust trying to push the nose left, kept the wheels on concrete until the airspeed dropped below 50 knots, and the A-10 finally consented to be just another piece of machinery instead of a living thing fighting for survival. She brought it to a stop 2/3 of the way down the runway, the single engine still running, and keyed the radio one final time. Guardian, Widow is down and stopped. Roll the ambulances. The operations center erupted. Cheers, applause, the kind of celebration that came from watching someone do the impossible and make it look almost routine. Tavish allowed himself a smile, brief and private, before keying his own microphone. Widow, Guardian, actual, outstanding work. Emergency services are rolling now. Welcome home. There was a pause, then Kovac's voice came back one last time, exhaustion finally creeping in around the edges. Guardian, thanks for the help. Tell your weather gods they owe me a drink. Widow is clear of the radio. The transmission ended. The blip on the tactical display stopped moving. Outside on the runway at Gardes, emergency crews swarmed the damaged A-10, while medics extracted 6 Navy SEALs who shouldn't have survived the night, but did. Carried to safety by a pilot flying an aircraft that had no business being airborne in those conditions, but stayed up anyway through skill and determination, and the kind of stubbornness that defined the warthog community. Later, after the SEALs had been evacuated to the surgical unit, and Kovac had been debriefed and fed and pointed toward quarters where she could sleep off the adrenaline crash, Tavish found her standing outside the hangar looking at her aircraft in the harsh work lights that illuminated the damage she'd been flying with. The A-10 looked like it had been through a war, which in fairness it had multiple holes punched through the tail section from the ground fire she'd mentioned. One engine completely cooked and already being red-tagged for replacement. Hydraulic fluid staining the concrete where it had been dripping from damaged lines, and ice still clinging to surfaces despite the hangar's relative warmth. She didn't turn when he approached, just kept staring at the aircraft like she was trying to memorize every detail. "Commander Tavish," she said without looking over. "I checked the roster. You were flying A-10s out of Bagram back when I was still learning to land straight." "I was," he confirmed, stopping beside her to study the same damage. "I heard what you did tonight. Heard you put this thing down in Tangier Valley under fire, loaded 6 people into a space that's supposed to hold survival gear, and then flew it through a storm that grounded everything else in theater. The SEALs you pulled out are talking already. One of them said you put 30mm rounds into a Taliban technical while on final approach just to make sure it wasn't a problem during the actual landing. She shrugged, the motion tired. Seemed like the efficient solution. The GAU-8 was already spun up and I had a clear shot. Would have been wasteful not to take it. Tavish studied her profile in the work lights, seeing the exhaustion that came from hours of high-intensity flying, seeing the lines around her eyes that told stories about too many nights like this one, too many close calls that ended well through skill rather than luck. The guy with the chest wound probably won't make it, she said quietly. I could hear the medic working on him during the flight, heard him tell the others it wasn't looking good. Petty Officer Second Class Anthony Mercado, Tavish supplied. They've got him in surgery now. The doctors say him getting to them when he did instead of 6 hours from now made the difference. He's got a fighting chance because you got him here while there was still something they could work with. Kavach nodded slowly, accepting the information without visible reaction. The call sign, Tavish said carefully. Widow, I read your file, I know why. Then you know I didn't pick it to be clever or memorable. I picked it because it's what I am, and because every time someone uses it over the radio, I remember why I'm still doing this instead of punching out and going to fly for the airlines. Your husband died doing his job. You don't have to punish yourself by taking every impossible mission that comes along. She turned to look at him then, and her eyes carried the kind of weight that came from carrying grief too long. I'm not punishing myself, Commander. I'm making sure his death meant something. He died covering his team's withdrawal, buying them time to get out when the whole operation went to hell. I was overhead that night. I heard him on the radio calling out targets, heard the gunfire, heard when he stopped transmitting. I put ordnance on everything that moved in that compound, but I was 30 seconds too late to save him. 30 seconds. So now when I get the chance to make sure someone else's husband makes it home, when I can be those 30 seconds for someone else, I take it. Every time. Without hesitation. Tavish had no response to that, because what could you say to someone who'd turned grief into mission focus, who'd weaponized loss into the kind of flying that saved lives through sheer unwillingness to accept failure? They stood in silence, watching as maintenance crews swarmed over the damaged A-10, cataloging failures and making the aircraft safe for transport back to a proper depot where it could be rebuilt. The airframe would fly again. Warthogs always did, their modular design making even extensive battle damage repairable, but not for a while. You should get some rest, Tavish finally said. The SEAL's commanding officer wants to meet you tomorrow, say thank you in person. The debriefing can wait until afternoon. Kavach nodded but didn't move, still studying the aircraft like she was saying goodbye to something. I'll be flying again in 3 days, she said. Different aircraft, same mission. There's always another team that needs close air support. Always another situation where someone needs the kind of help that only comes from a 30mm cannon. and a pilot willing to fly low enough to make eye contact with the people trying to kill them. "I know," Tavish said. "I've read your record. 57 combat missions in the last deployment cycle alone. The squadron commander says you volunteer for every flight. Take the missions nobody else wants because they're too dangerous or too close to the edge. Someone has to." She turned away from the aircraft, finally, and looked at him with eyes that were clear despite the exhaustion. Someone has to be willing to take the risks, to fly the missions where the margin for error is zero and the stakes are measured in lives. My husband understood that. He knew every time he went outside the wire that he might not come back, but he went anyway because that was the job and someone had to do it. I'm just carrying forward what he believed in. Tavish watched her walk away toward the quarters, her gait steady despite everything she'd been through. Behind him, the A-10 sat quiet in the work lights, scarred and damaged but intact, testament to both the ruggedness of the aircraft and the skill of the pilot who'd brought it home. In the surgical unit across the base, 6 Navy SEALs lay in various states of recovery, alive because one pilot had refused to accept the limitations everyone else lived with. And in the operations center, the recording of the night's events would be saved, studied, used as a training example of what was possible when skill met determination, met an aircraft that was too tough to know when it should quit. The storm continued to rage over the mountains, indifferent to the drama that had played out beneath its clouds. The weather would clear eventually. It always did, but the memory of what happened on this night would linger, passed from pilot to pilot in the telling, growing slightly larger with each retelling, until it became legend instead of history. But for those who were there, who watched the radar track through the impossible, who heard Kovach's voice stay calm through circumstances that would have broken lesser pilots, the truth needed no embellishment. Sometimes the real story was enough. Sometimes one person in one aircraft doing one impossible thing was all the legend anyone needed. Commander Tavish returned to the operations center, where Restrepo was completing the incident report, documenting every detail while the events were still fresh. She looked up as he entered, her expression thoughtful. "The SEAL team commander wants to put Captain Kovach in for a medal," she said. "Probably the Silver Star based on what I'm hearing. Single-handedly rescued 6 men from a hostile landing zone under fire, then flew them through impossible weather with battle damage and mechanical failures. It checks all the boxes." Tavish nodded slowly. "She'll decline it. She always does. I checked her record. She's been put in for decorations 4 times in the last 2 years. She's refused 3 of them, said she was just doing her job and didn't need recognition for what should be standard behavior." "That's stupid," Restrepo said bluntly. "What she did tonight was extraordinary by any measure. People should know about it." "People will know," Tavish assured her. "The SEALs will make sure of it. They take care of their own, and that extends to anyone who risks their life to save them." But whether she accepts official recognition or not is her choice, and we'll respect it either way. He settled into his chair and pulled up the weather forecast, already thinking about tomorrow's operations and the fact that Kovac would probably be back in the air within a week, taking whatever mission came along regardless of the risk level. The storm would pass, the aircraft would be repaired, and the war would continue, indifferent to individual acts of heroism, except in how they contributed to the larger grinding machinery of military operations. 3 days later, as promised, Captain Marlena Kovac walked across the flight line toward a different A-10, this one bearing different tail numbers but the same lethal capability. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, met her at the boarding ladder with a tablet showing the pre-flight inspection results. "She's good to go, ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the professional pride of someone who knew his work kept pilots alive. "All systems green, full load of 30 Mike, and enough Maverick missiles to ruin someone's entire afternoon. Where are we going today?" "North," Kovac replied, scanning the inspection results with practiced efficiency. "There's a team pinned down near the Pakistani border, taking fire from a reinforced position that artillery can't reach because of civilian structures nearby. They need someone who can tell the difference between a Taliban fighting position and a school, and who can put rounds exactly where they need to go without splashing damage where it doesn't." Rodriguez nodded, understanding the unspoken message. This was going to be one of those missions where precision mattered more than firepower, where the difference between effective close air support and a war crime was measured in meters and depended entirely on the judgment of the pilot in the cockpit. "You want me to load extra smoke rockets?" he asked. "Might help with marking targets if the visibility is poor." "Do it, and make sure the gun is feeding smoothly. I've got a feeling I'm going to be making multiple passes at low altitude, and I don't need a jam at an inconvenient moment." 20 minutes later, Widow 01 lifted off from Gardes into clear morning air, the storm system having finally moved east during the night. The flight north was routine by the standards of Afghanistan operations, which meant there was always the possibility of ground fire, always the chance that someone would try their luck with a shoulder-fired missile, always the awareness that routine could become interesting with no warning at all. Kovac flew low, below 5,000 feet, where the A-10 was most effective, and where the aircraft's titanium bathtub around the cockpit provided protection against the kind of ground fire they were most likely to encounter. The radio call came from a ground controller whose voice carried the tight control of someone managing a bad situation. "Any strike aircraft, this is Dragon 2-4. We are troops in contact, taking effective fire from a fortified position at grid November Papa 785423. Requesting immediate close air support, danger close, cleared hot on my mark." Kovacs checked her coordinates against the GPS display, calculating distance and approach vectors while simultaneously scanning the terrain ahead for threats. Dragon 2-4, Widow 01 is 5 minutes out with 30 Mike and precision munitions. Say enemy disposition and friendly positions. Widow Dragon. Hostiles are in a 2-story building, stone construction, approximately 40 meters north of our position. We're in a drainage ditch with limited cover, 6 personnel, 1 wounded. They've got a PKM machine gun and at least 2 shooters with automatic weapons. We tried to bound back, but they've got good fields of fire. We need you to silence that position so we can break contact and move to exfil. Danger close meant the friendlies were within weapons, affects range of the target, close enough that mistakes would be fatal. It was exactly the kind of mission the A-10 had been designed for, the kind of work that required pilot skill and aircraft capability in equal measure. Dragon Widow. I'll come in from the south, put eyes on your position first. Pop smoke to mark friendly location. Popping smoke now. 30 seconds later, Kovacs spotted the yellow smoke billowing up from a ditch that looked barely deep enough to provide cover against direct fire, let alone the kind of suppressive fire that a PKM machine gun could deliver. She could see the muzzle flashes from the building 40 meters north, could see the rounds kicking up dust around the ditch where the American team was pinned down. The geometry was ugly. The building was close enough to the friendlies that she'd need to be precise, but far enough that a low-angle gun run would put her directly in the line of fire from the target building and any other positions nearby. She made her decision in the seconds it took to complete the identification pass, pulling up and banking hard to set up for a gun run from the west, perpendicular to the line between friendlies and target. The angle would be harder, the shooting more demanding, but it would keep her away from the worst of the ground fire and give her a clear view of both the target and the friendly position. Dragon, Wid, is in from the west, hot with 30 Mike. Keep your heads down. The A-10 dropped into the attack run, airspeed building as Kovacs pushed the nose over and lined up the building in her sights. The GAU-8 cannon was the aircraft's reason for existing, 7 barrels rotating at 4,000 rounds per minute, each round a fist of depleted uranium capable of punching through tank armor or, in this case, reducing a stone building to rubble. She squeezed the trigger, felt the airframe shudder as the gun fired, walked the rounds across the target in a controlled burst that lasted exactly 3 seconds but delivered over 200 rounds into the building's second floor, where the machine gun was positioned. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The building's facade disintegrated under the impact. Stone and mortar turned to dust. The PKM position silenced in the time it took to breathe. Kovacs pulled up hard, rolled inverted to keep eyes on target, and came around for a second pass to confirm the kill. Dragon Widow, target is destroyed. I'm not seeing any movement. Can you confirm? There was a pause, then the ground controller came back with audible relief in his voice. Widow Dragon confirmed hostile fire has ceased. We are moving to exfil now. Thanks for the save. Dragon happy to help. Call if you need anything else. Widow is standing by overhead. She climbed back to altitude and began a slow orbit over the area, scanning for additional threats, while the team on the ground made their way to the extraction point. This was the routine that defined her deployment, not the dramatic emergency landings through storms, but the steady accumulation of missions where competence and precision made the difference between soldiers going home or being carried. The rest of the day brought two more close air support missions, neither as kinetic as the first, but both requiring the kind of careful flying that kept friendly forces safe while eliminating threats. By the time Kovacs landed back at Gardes as the sun was setting, she'd been airborne for 7 hours, expended most of her ammunition, and added 3 more missions to her logbook. Rodriguez met her at the aircraft again, already coordinating with the armament crews to reload for the next day's missions. "How'd she fly, ma'am?" he asked. Like she was angry at something and wanted everyone to know about it, Kovacs replied, the closest she ever came to a compliment. "The gun is still feeding smoothly. The targeting system stayed locked through some aggressive maneuvering, and nothing fell off that wasn't supposed to. I'll fly her again tomorrow." That night, in the ready room where pilots gathered to decompress and trade stories, the conversation eventually turned to the storm flight from 3 days earlier. A younger pilot, a lieutenant named Carson who'd arrived in theater 2 months ago, finally worked up the courage to ask the question everyone wanted answered. "Captain Kovacs, is it true you landed at Tangier Valley under fire? Everyone's talking about it, but the details keep changing depending on who's telling the story." Kovacs looked up from the mission planning documents she was reviewing, her expression neutral. "I put an A-10 down on a dirt strip in a narrow valley while people were shooting at me, loaded 6 SEALs aboard, and took off again before the Taliban could get organized enough to do anything about it. Then I flew through a storm because that was the direction that led to medical care for wounded men. It's not complicated." "The SEALs are calling you a legend," Carson pressed. "One of them stopped by the squadron yesterday trying to find you. He said you saved his entire team and did it like it was just another training exercise." "It was just another mission," Kovacs replied, her tone flat. "You do the job in front of you with the resources you have available. Sometimes that means landing in places that aren't on the charts and flying through weather that's less than ideal. If that makes me a legend, then half the pilots in this squadron qualify." An older captain, Di Marco, who'd been flying A-10s almost as long as Kovacs, shook his head. "That's not what the SEAL commander said in the email that went around to leadership. He said you were the kind of pilot that makes the Air Force look good, the kind of person we should all aspire to be. He's pushing hard for you to get recognized." "He can push all he wants," Kovacs said. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because 6 men needed help and I was in a position to provide it." That's the only calculation that mattered. Carson looked like he wanted to ask more questions, but Di Marco caught his eye and shook his head slightly. There were things you didn't push with senior pilots, especially ones like Kovac who wore their professionalism like armor against personal questions. The conversation moved on to safer topics, aircraft maintenance issues, the latest intelligence briefings, speculation about when the deployment would end and who would be going home first. But throughout it all, Kovac remained slightly separate, engaged when the discussion touched on tactical matters but distant when it veered toward the personal. Later, after most of the pilots had drifted away to their quarters, Di Marco lingered, pretending to review his own mission planning while actually waiting for Kovac to finish. When she finally closed her laptop and stood to leave, he spoke quietly. You know Carson didn't mean anything by the questions. He's young and still thinks flying in combat is going to be like the movies. He hasn't figured out yet that most of what we do is routine and the rest is just trying to survive the moments when routine becomes interesting. I know, Kovac replied. He'll learn, they all do, or they don't last long enough for it to matter. The call sign, though, widow, it makes people curious. You know that, right? They want to know the story, want to understand what drives someone to fly the way you do. She turned to look at him, and for just a moment the professional mask slipped enough to show the grief underneath. My husband died covering his team's withdrawal. I was overhead, providing close air support, close enough to hear everything on the radio but too far away to prevent what happened. He bought his team 30 seconds with his life, 30 seconds that let them break contact and survive. So now I fly missions that let other people's husbands go home, and I do it without hesitation or doubt because I remember exactly what those 30 seconds cost. That's the story. That's what drives me. And if people are curious about it, they can stay curious because I'm not interested in being therapy for someone else's need to understand combat losses. Di Marco nodded slowly. Fair enough. But for what it's worth, what you're doing matters. The teams on the ground, they know they can count on you to show up regardless of the weather, regardless of the threats, regardless of anything else. That kind of reliability is rare and it saves lives. Then I'm doing my job, Kovac said simply. That's all any of us can do. She walked out into the night air, leaving Di Marco alone in the ready room with his thoughts. The base was quiet at this hour, most personnel already settled into quarters or standing watch at various posts. The flight line stretched out in the darkness, A-10s parked in neat rows, their angular silhouettes visible against the lights that marked the taxiways and runways. Kovac walked toward them, drawn by the same impulse that brought her out here most nights when sleep wouldn't come. The aircraft were simple, honest in their ugliness and their purpose. They didn't ask questions about motivation or grief. They didn't need explanations for why someone might choose to fly missions that others avoided. They simply existed as tools designed for a specific task, and they performed that task with brutal efficiency when guided by skilled hands. She stopped in front of the A-10 she'd be flying tomorrow, ran her hand along the titanium skin that protected the cockpit, felt the cold metal under her palm. Somewhere out there in the darkness, there were teams preparing for missions that would take them into harm's way. Tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, one of those teams would need help, would need someone overhead with a cannon that could reach into places artillery couldn't touch and precision that could distinguish between threats and innocence. She would be there when they called. She would always be there when they called, because that was the promise she'd made to herself the day she adopted the call sign that defined her. Widow, not because she was broken or bitter, but because she understood exactly what it cost when help arrived 30 seconds too late, and she dedicated herself to making sure that didn't happen on her watch. The next morning brought fog that delayed operations for 2 hours, then cleared to reveal another day in an endless series of days that defined deployment life. Kavach flew 3 missions, all of them routine by the standards of a combat zone, all of them necessary. The days began to blur together, marked by the rhythm of pre-dawn briefings, hours in the cockpit, post-mission debriefs, and restless sleep punctuated by dreams that rarely brought rest. 2 weeks after the storm flight, a package arrived at the squadron addressed to her. Inside was a patch, the insignia of the SEAL team she'd extracted, along with a handwritten note from their commander. Captain Kavach, all 6 of my boys made it home. Mercado spent 3 weeks in the hospital, but he's going to make a full recovery. The doctors said getting him to surgery when you did was the difference between life and death. My team wanted you to have this patch and to know that you'll always be welcome at our command. If you're ever stateside and near Virginia Beach, look us up. The first round is on us, and we'll tell you the story of how 6 SEALs got rescued by the most badass A-10 driver any of us have ever seen. VR, Commander James Haddock. Kavach read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in her locker along with the patch. She wouldn't wear it. Regulations were specific about unauthorized insignia on flight suits, but she'd keep it. Another small reminder that the missions mattered even when they felt routine, that the difference between someone going home or being mourned was often measured in the decisions pilots made in the seconds between identifying a threat and pressing a trigger. That afternoon, she was called to the squadron commander's office. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Brennan looked up from her desk as Kavach entered, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes warm. "Have a seat, Marlena. We need to talk about your flight schedule." Kavach sat, wary of where this conversation might lead. Talks about flight schedules usually meant someone thought you were flying too much, taking too many risks, needed to slow down for your own good. "You've flown 53 missions in the last 45 days, Brennan continued. "That's nearly twice the average for pilots in this squadron. You're volunteering for every flight, taking missions that other pilots decline because they're too dangerous or the weather is too marginal. Your crew chief says you're spending more time in the cockpit than out of it. I'm within the maximum flight hour restrictions, Kovacs replied carefully. I'm not violating any regulations. I'm not concerned about regulations. I'm concerned about you. When was the last time you took a day off? When was the last time you did anything besides fly, brief, debrief, and sleep? I don't need time off. I need to fly missions that make a difference. Brennan leaned back in her chair, studying Kovacs with the kind of evaluation that came from years of leadership experience. I read the incident report from the Tangier Valley extraction. I also read the weather reports from that night and talked to the operations center personnel who were working your flight. What you did was extraordinary, but it was also dangerous in ways that went beyond normal combat risk. You put yourself and your aircraft into situations where the margin for survival was essentially zero, and you did it without hesitation. I made the tactical decision that 6 men on the ground were worth more than 1 aircraft and pilot. That's not extraordinary. That's basic combat calculus. It's extraordinary when that calculus consistently involves you taking risks that other pilots won't take, flying missions that others decline, and pushing yourself to the edge of physical and mental exhaustion in the process. Marlena, I need you to be honest with me. Are you trying to prove something, or are you trying to join your husband? The question landed like a physical blow. Kovac's jaw tightened, her hands clenching on the arms of the chair. Permission to speak freely, ma'am. Always. I am not suicidal. I am not trying to get myself killed. I am simply unwilling to accept the limitations that other people live with when those limitations mean soldiers on the ground don't get the support they need. My husband died because help arrived 30 seconds too late. I fly the way I do to make sure that doesn't happen to someone else. If that makes me extraordinary or concerning, or whatever other label you want to apply, fine. But don't confuse dedication to mission with a death wish. Brennan held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, I believe you, but I'm still going to ask you to take 2 days off starting tomorrow. That's not a request, that's an order. Go to the gym, read a book, sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. Do something that reminds you that there's a world outside the cockpit. Then come back and fly the next 50 missions if that's what you want to do. Kovacs wanted to argue, wanted to push back against the enforced rest, but she recognized the expression on Brennan's face. This was a line that wouldn't be moved. Yes, ma'am, 2 days. And Marlena, the SEAL command put you in for the Silver Star. I endorsed it and sent it up the chain. You can decline it if you want, but the paperwork is already in motion. Just thought you should know. Kovacs stood, came to attention, and delivered a crisp salute before leaving the office. Behind her, Brennan watched her go and wondered, not for the first time, what the Air Force should do with pilots who were so dedicated to their mission that they forgot to be human. The 2 days off passed slowly. Kovacs spent them maintaining her personal gear, working out until exhaustion forced her to stop, and trying not to count the hours until she could fly again. On the morning of the third day, she was back on the flight schedule, back in the cockpit, back to the routine of missions that mattered because they kept people alive. The deployment continued. Weeks turned into months. The weather shifted from winter storms to spring turbulence to summer heat that made low-level flying feel like moving through a furnace. Kavach flew through all of it, accumulating missions and flight hours at a pace that made her the most experienced combat pilot in the squadron despite not being the senior in rank. Other pilots came to her with questions about tactics, about aircraft handling, about how to manage the stress of combat flying. She answered them with the same professional competence she brought to everything, sharing knowledge without pretense, teaching without condescension. The younger pilots started calling her the widow, with a mix of respect and awe, using the call sign as both identifier and title. Then, in late summer, the mission came that would cement her legend beyond anything the Storm flight had accomplished. The call came at 0:30, ripping Kavach from the shallow sleep she'd been managing. The duty officer's voice was tight with controlled urgency. "Captain Kavach, we need you airborne in 20 minutes. There's a situation developing near the Pakistani border. A reconnaissance team is compromised and taking heavy fire. They need immediate close air support, and you're the only pilot qualified for the munitions required." Kavach was moving before the duty officer finished speaking, muscle memory taking over as she dressed and grabbed her gear. 20 minutes to be airborne meant no time for a full brief, no time for careful mission planning. This would be a scramble launch. Get there fast and sort out the details en route. The crew chief had Widow 01 already pulled out of the hangar, the pre-flight inspection completed, engines ready to start. Kavach climbed the ladder, settled into the familiar cockpit, and began the abbreviated startup sequence, while the crew chief pumped the radio and navigation coordinates into the aircraft systems. "You're loaded with a full combat mix," Rodriguez shouted up to her over the sound of the engines spooling up. 30 Mike, 4 Mavericks and 2 500-pound laser-guided bombs. Whatever you're going into, you've got the tools to handle it. Kavach gave him a thumbs up, completed the final checks, and taxied toward the runway with an efficiency born of countless repetitions. The tower cleared her immediately, recognizing the priority that came with a scramble launch, and she was airborne within 18 minutes of the initial call, climbing into the pre-dawn darkness toward coordinates that would take her to the edge of Pakistani airspace. The intelligence brief came over the radio as she climbed, delivered by an operations officer who sounded like he hadn't slept in days. "Widow, be advised your target area is a compound approximately 2 kilometers from the Pakistani border. Reconnaissance Team Viper 37 has been compromised and is taking effective fire from multiple positions. Pakistani military has been alerted to the situation, but they're not in position to assist. You are cleared hot on any target positively identified as hostile. But be aware that border proximity means you need to be absolutely certain of target location before you engage. The warning was clear: screw up the navigation and put ordnance across the border into Pakistan, and the diplomatic consequences would be severe. This was the kind of mission where precision mattered more than speed, where the difference between effective close air support and an international incident was measured in meters and depended entirely on the pilot's judgment. Guardian, Widow copies all. ETA to target area is 12 minutes. Requesting positive identification procedures and rules of engagement. The response came from a different voice, this one belonging to the ground team commander whose personnel were in contact. Widow, Viper 37 actual. We are in a defensive position taking fire from at least 3 locations. Hostiles are in buildings northeast, east, and southeast of our position at distances ranging from 100 to 300 meters. We have 2 wounded, 1 critical. We need you to suppress those positions so we can break contact and move to exfil. I will mark our position with infrared strobe hostile positions with laser designation. You are cleared to engage laser-designated targets only. How copy? Viper, Widow copies all. I have good laser receiver ready to engage on your mark. 12 minutes out. Those 12 minutes stretched like hours. Kovac flew through the darkness, navigating by instruments and GPS, while mentally preparing for the kind of precise flying that would be required. 3 separate targets at varying distances from friendly forces meant 3 separate attack runs, each one requiring careful setup and execution to avoid fratricide while still being effective against the threats. The compound appeared on her targeting display as she approached, a cluster of buildings visible on infrared as heat signatures against the cooler background. She could see the muzzle flashes from the hostile positions, could see the IR strobe marking, where the reconnaissance team was pinned down in a position that offered minimal cover. The geometry was challenging, but not impossible. She'd need to come in from different angles for each target to maintain safe separation from the friendly position while still getting clean shots at the threats. Viper, Widow is overhead at Angels 12. I have your position marked, holding for laser designation of first target. Widow, Viper. Laser on first target northeast building, 150 meters from my position. This one has a heavy machine gun that's keeping us pinned. Need it silenced first. The laser spot appeared on her display, a glowing point that marked where her weapons would impact if she released at the right moment. Kovac rolled into the attack run, dropping the nose and accelerating as she lined up the shot. The laser-guided bomb would do the job perfectly. 500 pounds of high explosive that would follow the laser designation to within a meter of the aim point, close enough to be certain but precise enough to avoid endangering the friendlies nearby. Viper, Widow is in from the north, hot with GBU-12. 15 seconds. She pickled the bomb at the calculated release point, felt the aircraft lighten as the weapon came off the rail, and immediately pulled into a climbing turn to avoid overflying the target area. The bomb tracked true, following the laser guidance all the way to impact. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn darkness, a brilliant flash followed by the deep rumble of 500 pounds of explosive doing what it was designed to do. When the smoke cleared, the northeast building was gone, reduced to rubble that would never threaten anyone again. Viper Widow, first target destroyed, ready for next designation. Widow Viper, outstanding. Laser on second target, east building, 200 meters. Multiple shooters, small arms and RPGs. The second run came in from a different angle, threading between the friendly position and the Pakistani border with minimal margin for navigation error. Another laser-guided bomb, another perfect release, another building transformed into a smoking crater. 2 down, 1 to go, and Kovac could hear the relief in the ground commander's voice when he called for the third target designation. Widow Viper, last target is southeast building, 300 meters. This one's farther out, not an immediate threat, but they'll become one if we try to move. Can you suppress it? Viper, I can do better than suppress. Stand by. Instead of using her last bomb, Kovac opted for the GAU-8 cannon. The range was at the outer edge of effective engagement distance for the gun, but she had a clear line of sight and the accuracy to make it work. The 30mm rounds would be more than sufficient to neutralize the threat without expending her last precision munition. She rolled into the gun run, lined up the building in her sights, and squeezed the trigger in a controlled burst that walked rounds through the target with mechanical precision. The effect was immediate. The building's walls disintegrated under the impact. The shooters inside silenced in the seconds it took for 200 rounds of depleted uranium to arrive on target. Viper Widow, third target is neutralized. You're clear to move. Widow Viper, we're moving now. You just saved our lives. Thank you doesn't begin to cover it, but thank you anyway. Kovac climbed back to altitude and established an orbit over the area, providing overwatch while the reconnaissance team made their way to the extraction point. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern horizon now, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold that would have been beautiful if not for the violence that had just unfolded below. The extraction went smoothly. A pair of helicopters darting in to collect the team and their wounded before disappearing back toward friendly territory. Kovac remained on station until they were clear, then turned south toward Gardez and the routine of post-mission debrief and paperwork that would document another successful mission in an endless series of them. When she landed, Rodriguez met her at the aircraft with his usual efficiency, already coordinating the reload and refuel that would have the A-10 ready for the next mission. But this time he had company, a senior officer Kovac didn't recognize, a brigadier general whose uniform was crisp despite the early hour and whose expression suggested this wasn't a social visit. "Captain Kovac," the general said as she descended the ladder. "I'm Brigadier General Nathan Cross, Air Combat Command. I need a few minutes of your time." They walked to a quiet corner of the hangar, away from the noise of flight operations and the eyes of curious personnel. Cross studied her with the kind of evaluation that suggested he was seeing more than just her uniform and rank. "I've been reading your mission reports," he said without preamble. "The Storm flight, the Tangier Valley extraction, and now this morning's precision strike work near the Pakistani border. You're developing quite a reputation as the pilot who takes the missions nobody else wants and makes them look routine." "I'm just doing my job, sir," Kovac replied, falling back on the professional neutrality that served her well in these situations. "I fly the missions I'm assigned, and I complete them to the best of my ability. That's what the Air Force pays me to do." "That's an interesting way to frame it, considering you volunteer for approximately 80% of your missions. The squadron commander says you're flying twice the missions of any other pilot in the unit, and you're doing it while maintaining a perfect safety record despite taking risks that make the safety officers nervous." Cross paused, then continued in a tone that suggested he was genuinely curious rather than critical. "Why? What drives someone to fly like you do? It's not about the recognition. You've declined multiple awards. It's not about advancement. You've turned down opportunities to move into leadership positions that would be career-enhancing. So what is it?" Kovac met his gaze steadily. "My husband was a ranger, sir. He died covering his team's withdrawal during a raid that went wrong. I was overhead that night, providing close air support, close enough to hear what happened on the radio. He bought his team 30 seconds with his life, 30 seconds that let them break contact and survive. I fly the way I do because I remember exactly what those 30 seconds cost, and I'm unwilling to let that happen to someone else if I can prevent it. That's what drives me. That's what gets me in the cockpit every day ready to take whatever mission comes along. Not for awards or recognition or career advancement, but because I know what it means when help arrives too late, and I've dedicated myself to making sure that doesn't happen on my watch." Cross nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. "The call sign, widow. Now I understand why you keep it despite the fact that it raises eyebrows and makes people uncomfortable. It's supposed to make people uncomfortable, sir. It's supposed to remind everyone, including me, that this job has consequences beyond the missions we fly. Every time someone uses it over the radio, I remember why I'm doing this, and I think that's important." "Fair enough." Cross shifted his stance, moving from evaluation mode to something more purposeful. "Captain Kovac, the reason I'm here is that Air Combat Command is standing up a new training program focused on advanced close air support tactics in complex environments. We're looking for experienced pilots to serve as instructors, People who can teach the next generation how to operate effectively in situations where the margin for error is minimal and the stakes are measured in lives. Your name came up repeatedly during the selection process. I'm here to offer you the position. Kavach felt something cold settle in her stomach. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested in a training assignment. I'm a combat pilot. My place is here, flying missions, not stateside teaching people how to do what I can do better by staying operational. I understand the instinct, Cross replied, but consider the larger picture. You can fly one aircraft, complete one mission at a time, save one team when they need help. Or you can train 100 pilots who will each fly hundreds of missions over their careers, multiplying your effectiveness across an entire generation of close air support operations. The math is compelling. The math doesn't account for the teams that need help today, sir. While I'm teaching people how to fly close air support, there are soldiers on the ground who need someone who already knows how. I'm not willing to leave that to chance when I can be here making sure it gets done right. Cross studied her for a long moment, then nodded. I can't force you to take the assignment, and honestly, the Air Force needs pilots like you in operational squadrons as much as we need instructors. But the offer stands if you change your mind. In the meantime, keep doing what you're doing. Just try not to give the safety officers heart attacks in the process. He left, and Kavach returned to the routine of deployment life, putting the conversation out of her mind as she prepared for the next mission. But the general's visit had an unexpected effect. Word spread through the squadron about the training assignment she'd turned down, adding another layer to the growing legend that surrounded her flying. The younger pilots started seeking her out more frequently, asking questions about tactics and decision-making, trying to learn from someone who demonstrated mastery of the aircraft and the mission in ways that textbooks couldn't teach. Kavach found herself becoming an informal mentor despite her preference for operating alone, sharing knowledge, because she recognized that Cross had been right about one thing. Teaching others extended her effectiveness beyond what she could accomplish in a single cockpit. 3 months later, her deployment ended. The transition from combat operations to garrison life was jarring. The intensity of daily missions replaced by the routine of peacetime training, and the administrative burden that came with being back in the continental United States. Kavach requested an immediate return to combat operations, citing operational necessity and the need for experienced pilots in theater. The request was denied. Instead, she was assigned to the Weapons Instructor course at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, a position that came with the explanation that the Air Force needed her expertise in developing the next generation of A-10 pilots, whether she wanted to provide it or not. The first day of class, she stood in front of 12 carefully selected pilots, each of them experienced but hungry for the advanced knowledge that would make them better at their jobs. She looked at their faces, saw the mixture of respect and curiosity and determination, and made a decision about how this would work. "My name is Captain Marlena Kovac," she began. "My call sign is Widow, and before you ask, yes, there's a story behind it, and no, I'm not sharing it. What I am going to share is everything I've learned about flying close air support in environments where mistakes are fatal and precision is the only thing that matters. Over the next 6 weeks, you're going to learn how to put ordnance on target in conditions that would make most pilots turn around. You're going to learn how to make decisions in seconds that will determine whether soldiers on the ground go home or get carried. And you're going to learn that the aircraft we fly is just a tool. What matters is the judgment and skill of the pilot in the cockpit." She paused, letting her words sink in, then continued. "I don't care about your previous flight hours or your service reputation or anything else you've done before walking into this classroom. All I care about is whether you can learn what I'm going to teach, and whether you'll have the judgment to use it appropriately when lives are on the line. Some of you will succeed. Some of you will wash out. The difference will be your willingness to accept that there's always something more to learn. That competence is built through repetition and analysis and a willingness to push beyond what feels comfortable." Questions. A hand went up in the back. "Ma'am, is it true you landed an A-10 in a mountain valley under fire and then flew through a storm that had grounded everything else?" Kovac's expression didn't change. "It's true. I made a tactical decision that putting an aircraft at risk was worth extracting 6 men who would have died otherwise. I then flew through conditions that were dangerous but not insurmountable to get them to medical care. That mission is a good example of what we'll be covering in this course: decision-making under pressure, flying at the edges of aircraft performance, and maintaining focus when everything is trying to kill you. Now, any questions that are actually relevant to the course material?" The class settled into focused attention, recognizing that they were in the presence of someone who'd done things they'd only read about, and who was now offering to teach them how to do the same. Over the following weeks, Kovac proved to be a demanding instructor, pushing her students through increasingly complex scenarios that forced them to demonstrate not just flying skill, but the judgment that separated adequate pilots from exceptional ones. She taught them how to read terrain, how to integrate with ground forces, how to make split-second calculations about weapons employment that accounted for collateral damage and friendly positions and target characteristics. She taught them how to fly through weather that would make meteorologists weep, how to manage battle damage that would send most pilots running for the nearest airfield, how to complete missions when everything had gone wrong, and the only thing left was determination and skill. The pilots who graduated from her course went on to their operational assignments carrying not just technical knowledge, but a philosophy of flying that prioritized effectiveness over caution, mission completion over personal comfort, and the needs of soldiers on the ground over their own safety. They spread through the A-10 community like seeds planted in fertile ground, each of them carrying forward the lessons they'd learned from the pilot known as the Widow. Years passed. Kovacs continued teaching, accumulated thousands of flight hours across multiple deployments, and became one of the most respected voices in the close air support community. The legend that had started with a storm flight and a mountain valley landing grew with each class she taught, each mission she flew, each pilot she mentored who went on to accomplish extraordinary things because they'd learned from someone who'd already done them. She never remarried. The call sign remained her constant companion, a reminder of what had been lost and what she'd chosen to do with that loss. When asked about it in interviews or formal settings, she gave the same answer she'd been giving for years. It was personal, it was meaningful, and it wasn't open for discussion. Those who knew her well understood that the call sign was armor as much as identifier, a way of keeping the grief contained while still acknowledging its existence. And then, 15 years after the storm flight that had made her a legend, came the mission that would become her legacy. The call came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, interrupting a routine training flight. "Widow Guardian, we have an emergency situation developing. Multiple teams are pinned down in a complex ambush situation near Kandahar. Weather is degrading rapidly, and you're the closest qualified asset. Request immediate divert to coordinates being uploaded now." Kovacs checked her fuel state, calculated distance to target, and made the decision in seconds. "Guardian, Widow is diverting now. Send me everything you have on the situation." What she received over the next 10 minutes painted a picture of a disaster in progress. 4 separate special operations teams had been drawn into a coordinated ambush, taking casualties and unable to extract under the volume of fire they were receiving. The weather was collapsing, a fast-moving storm system that was already generating the kind of conditions that would ground less experienced pilots. And into this situation came Captain Marlena Kovacs, 15 years older than the pilot who'd flown through the storm to extract 6 SEALs, but with 15 more years of experience to bring to bear. She flew toward the coordinates alone, arriving overhead to find a situation that was somehow worse than described. 6 teams now, not 4, all of them in contact, all of them taking casualties. The enemy force larger and better equipped than initial intelligence had suggested. The weather was everything the forecast had promised and more, visibility dropping towards zero as rain and dust combined to create a brownout that made visual references impossible. Over the next 4 hours, Kovacs conducted 17 separate attack runs, expending every weapon aboard her aircraft, and then coordinating with other assets to bring additional fire support onto target. She flew through weather that would have grounded everyone else, put ordnance on targets that were closer to friendly forces than any safety margin allowed, and made decisions in seconds that saved lives while eliminating threats. She took ground fire that punched holes through both wings and damaged her hydraulic systems. She flew with warning lights illuminated and systems degraded, nursing the aircraft through conditions that should have sent her looking for the nearest emergency landing site. When the ammunition was gone, she remained overhead providing reconnaissance and coordination, talking other aircraft onto targets while simultaneously helping ground commanders orchestrate the extraction of their wounded. By the time the last team was clear and she turned south toward home, the A-10 she was flying looked like it had been through a war. Ground fire damage, stress cracks from violent maneuvering, hydraulic fluid streaming from damaged lines, and warning lights illuminated across every system panel. The aircraft should not have been flying, but it was flying because Kovacs refused to accept any other outcome, because 15 years of experience had taught her exactly how much the aircraft could endure and how to extract the last ounce of performance from systems that were degraded but not destroyed. She landed at Kandahar as the sun set, touching down on a runway that was barely visible through the weather, and taxied clear with the emergency crews following her every move. When she finally shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, she found herself surrounded by personnel who'd been following the mission over the radio, who'd heard her calm voice orchestrating miracles while flying through conditions that terrified everyone listening. The teams she'd saved wanted to meet her. The commanders wanted to debrief her. The maintenance crews wanted to understand how the aircraft was still flying given the damage it had sustained. But Kovacs waved them all off, exhaustion finally catching up with her, and pointed toward the aircraft with a tired smile. She did the work. I just pointed her in the right direction and pulled the trigger when needed. If you want to thank someone, thank the engineers who built something tough enough to take this kind of abuse and bring me home. I'm going to file my mission report and then sleep for about 12 hours. Everything else can wait. The mission report, when it was finally written and submitted, was characteristically understated, a factual recounting of the situation, the actions taken, the results achieved. No drama, no embellishment, just the clinical documentation of 4 hours during which one pilot and one aircraft accomplished what should have required an entire flight of aircraft to complete. The recommendation for the Air Force Cross came 3 weeks later, submitted jointly by the ground force commanders whose teams had been extracted, and by the Air Combat Command leadership who recognized that what had happened went beyond even the high standards of the A-10 community. This time, Kovacs didn't decline. When asked why she was accepting this award after refusing others, her answer was simple. Because this one isn't about me. It's about everyone who flew the mission alongside me, everyone on the ground who fought their way out of an impossible situation, everyone who contributed to getting people home alive. If accepting this award means those stories get told and those people get recognized, then I'll accept it. The ceremony was held 6 months later at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. attended by the senior leadership of the Air Force and representatives from every team that had been involved in the mission. Kovacs stood at attention as the citation was read, the formal language somehow failing to capture the reality of what had happened, but serving its purpose of officially recognizing achievement beyond the normal call of duty. When the medal was pinned to her uniform and she was asked to say a few words, she kept it brief. 15 years ago, I lost my husband during a combat operation. He was a ranger, a team leader, and he died buying his team 30 seconds that let them survive. I became a pilot who takes the missions nobody else wants because I remember exactly what those 30 seconds cost. And I've dedicated my career to making sure that other people's husbands and wives and brothers and sisters get their 30 seconds when they need them. This medal represents every mission where that mattered, every time someone on the ground called for help, and got it because we refused to accept limitations. I'm honored to accept it on behalf of everyone who flies close air support, everyone who puts themselves between danger and the people who need protecting. Thank you. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, recognition not just for the specific mission, but for a career that had become synonymous with excellence in close air support operations. After the ceremony, as Kovacs made her way through the crowd of well-wishers and colleagues, she was stopped by a young captain she didn't recognize. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you. You were my instructor at the weapons school 5 years ago. Everything you taught me, I used it during my deployment last year. I flew missions I wouldn't have survived without the training you provided. You saved lives by teaching me how to save lives, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. Kovacs shook the young captain's hand and felt something shift inside her, a recognition that General Cross had been right all those years ago. Teaching multiplied effectiveness across generations in ways that individual missions, no matter how successful, could never achieve. She'd spent 15 years proving she could fly any mission, handle any situation, bring anyone home regardless of the odds. Maybe it was time to accept that the next phase of her career meant ensuring others could do the same. 2 years later, Colonel Marlena Kovacs, she'd finally accepted the promotion that came with seniority and achievement, stood in front of a new class of weapons instructor students. She was grayer now, the lines around her eyes deeper, but the intensity remained unchanged. "My name is Colonel Kovacs," she began, using the same opening she'd used for years. "My call sign is Widow, and before you ask, yes, there's a story behind it. And yes, I'm going to share it, because you're old enough and experienced enough to understand why it matters." She told them about her husband, about the night he died buying his team 30 seconds to survive, about the decision she'd made to turn grief into mission focus, and loss into the determination to make sure other people got their 30 seconds when they needed them. She told them about the storm flight, about Tangier Valley, about the 4-hour mission that earned her the Air Force Cross. She told them about all the missions in between, the routine ones and the dramatic ones, the successes and the close calls. And then she told them why she was sharing all of this. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what drives excellence in this profession. It's not about being fearless. Fear is healthy and keeps you from making stupid decisions. It's not about being invincible. The aircraft can be killed and so can you. It's about being unwilling to accept failure when failure means people die who didn't have to. It's about recognizing that the decisions you make in the cockpit have consequences that extend far beyond your own survival, and accepting the responsibility that comes with that recognition. Over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to teach you everything I know about flying close air support. Some of it will be technical, weapons employment, tactics, aircraft handling. Some of it will be judgment, how to make decisions under pressure, how to balance risk against necessity, how to know when to push forward and when to pull back. All of it will be aimed at making you the kind of pilot who can be counted on when everything has gone wrong, and the only thing standing between disaster and survival is your ability to fly your aircraft exactly right. The class that graduated 6 weeks later was among the best Kovach had ever taught. They went on to operational assignments across the A-10 community, carrying forward not just technical skills, but a philosophy of flying that had been forged in combat and refined through years of experience. They became instructors themselves, multiplying the lessons across another generation, creating a lineage of excellence that could be traced directly back to a pilot who turned personal loss into professional dedication. Years continued to pass. Kovach accumulated more missions, more students, more impact on the community she'd served for over 2 decades. The call sign remained, acknowledged now not as something uncomfortable, but as a symbol of the commitment that defined her career. When younger pilots asked about it, older ones would explain, not the personal details which remained private, but the meaning behind it, the reminder that their job had consequences, and that excellence mattered because lives depended on it. And then, 23 years after the storm flight that had started it all, Colonel Marlena Kovach flew her final mission. It was supposed to be routine, a training flight with a student, demonstrating advanced tactics in the same airspace where she'd flown hundreds of previous missions. But routine had a way of becoming interesting without warning, and when the call came that a team was in trouble 40 miles away, Kovach didn't hesitate. She diverted, took control from her student, and flew one last time into a situation that required exactly the kind of flying she'd been doing for over 2 decades. The mission was successful. The team was extracted. The aircraft returned to base with minor battle damage, and Kovach completed her post-mission brief with the same professional competence she demonstrated throughout her career. And then she walked into the squadron commander's office and submitted her retirement paperwork. "It's time," she said simply when asked why. "I've flown every mission I needed to fly, taught everyone I needed to teach." There are younger pilots who can do this job now, people I trained who are better than I was at their age. My work is done. The retirement ceremony 3 months later drew attendance from across the Air Force and the Joint Special Operations community. SEALs, Rangers, Special Forces operators, all of them came to honor a pilot who'd saved their lives or the lives of people they served with. The speeches were long and heartfelt, recounting missions and achievements that filled a career most people could only dream about. When Kovach finally took the podium for her own remarks, she surveyed the audience and felt the weight of 23 years settling into something like satisfaction. When I adopted the call sign Widow, it was because I needed a reminder of what had been lost and why it mattered. My husband died buying his team 30 seconds to survive, and I dedicated my career to making sure other people got their 30 seconds when they needed them. I flew missions that others wouldn't fly, took risks that others wouldn't take, and pushed myself and my aircraft to the limits of performance, because I knew that anything less meant people might die who didn't have to. But I didn't do any of it alone. Every mission involved crew chiefs who kept the aircraft flying, operations personnel who provided the intelligence and coordination, and the teams on the ground who trusted me to show up when they called. This retirement isn't about me leaving. It's about recognizing that the mission continues with or without any individual pilot, and that the best legacy anyone can leave is having trained the people who will carry it forward. I'm proud of what I've accomplished, but I'm more proud of the pilots I've trained who are now doing the same work I did, and who will train the next generation to do it even better. That's how excellence persists. That's how we honor the people we've lost. That's how 30 seconds of bought time becomes a lifetime of saved lives. She stepped down from the podium to sustained applause, removed her flight suit for the final time, and walked out of the building into a civilian life that felt both foreign and right. The aircraft would keep flying. The missions would continue. Other pilots would take the calls that required someone to push beyond normal limits and accomplish what seemed impossible. But they would do it carrying forward the lessons taught by a pilot known as the Widow, whose name had become synonymous with excellence in close air support, whose career had defined what was possible when skill met determination, met an unwillingness to accept failure. And somewhere, in the database of call signs used by Air Force pilots, Widow remained retired out of respect, never to be assigned to another pilot because some names carried too much history to be recycled. It had become a legend, a reminder, and a standard, the mark of a pilot who'd flown her entire career as if every mission mattered, because she knew they did, because she'd learned the cost of help arriving 30 seconds too late and had dedicated herself to making sure it never happened on her watch. The legacy lived on in the pilots she'd trained, in the teams she'd saved, in the tactics she'd developed that became standard across the community. Even the SEALs froze, not in fear but in respect, When the widow's A-10 came back through the storm, because they knew that when she showed up, survival became possible even in impossible situations, because she refused to accept any other outcome. That refusal, that dedication, that unwavering commitment to mission over self, that was the real story behind the call sign, the truth that made it legendary. And it would be told and retold as long as pilots flew close air support, as long as soldiers needed someone overhead who could make the difference between going home and being carried, as long as the Air Force needed examples of what excellence looked like when tested by circumstance and proven through action.